Well, hello. It's so lovely to be here today with Richard Backhouse, who is the chair of HMC this year. Richard, lovely to see you.
Nice to see you again, Helen. Long time since we were both head teachers in the Southwest.
I know. It feels like, it does feel like a million miles ago. Talking about million, you've been doing million things, haven't you, actually? What have you been up to?
So last year, when we had that famous Lent term that lasted a day before we were all sent home, I resolved to do something of a challenge while locked away. So I resolved to row 1 million meters on a rowing machine to raise funds for our bursary program.
And did you? Yes, of course you did.
I did. I finished on Remembrance Sunday, November the 14th. It's etched on my mind. I was determined to finish with a half marathon. So I finished with 21,098 meters, which I finished in just over an hour and 36 minutes. And I have not sat on a rowing machine since November the 14th. At some stage, I have probably better get acquainted with my rowing machine again. But I've enjoyed the 4 months since of not having to sit there going backwards and forwards.
But you've been very
nowhere, of course.
Well, that's true. But you've been very busy in that time. I mean, and your role at HMC. I mean, what is on HMC's agenda at the moment? You know, to tell us about that.
So HMC is a members association. So the main function of HMC is to support HMC heads. I think that means HMC's agenda is making sure that their leadership is fully equipped, resourced, that they have people to turn to, they know who to turn to for advice or for help when they need it. So the HMC's agenda is whatever its members' agenda is. And the last 2 years have certainly been challenging for leadership in schools. Yeah. And I think I'm enormously proud of the way in which the sector served its pupils and families in the last 2 years. But that, I think, has been at the cost of a great deal of strain for teachers, senior leaders in schools and heads. And so the agenda, I think, has been to make sure those people are really well supported. Individual schools have a variety of things on their agendas at the moment, whether that's federated schools. We've seen some consolidation in the last couple of years, whether it's other changes to structure, whether it's culture, with the challenges to us from Black Lives Matter and everyone's invited. Important that schools make really good responses to those things. The post-pandemic world, the way in which that's going to be different. And then I think I see growing number of heads who have real concern for public benefit and for bursary programs, for making their schools relevant in new ways. I think they've always been relevant, but I think changing world requires change to remain relevant and focused on preparing young people as best we can for the world they're going into.
And that's one of the things that really strikes me about our colleagues, though, when you talk to any head in schools, is that they actually genuinely want the best for children and young people, and that preparation for the world. I mean, that's been tough, keeping that vision going. How do you see people emerging from the pandemic and with that vision intact? I mean, how can we help them?
I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things is that the pandemic has stored up a set of things that we will need to unlock to help resolve over the coming months. We know that the waiting list for CAMHS help for young people has never been longer than it is at the moment, and that it can be a really long time for young people to get the support they need with mental health. So I think there are particular things there for schools to be focused on, providing support for families and for young people. And I expect some of those revelations to take, I don't think they've all come out yet. I think more will come out of the strain, particularly reduced socialization for young people.
Yes.
Actually, the HMC Spring Conference in May will have Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, Professor Tamsin Ford, and Dr. Amy Orban talking about the psychology around teenage, the neuroscience of the teenage brain, the effect of dependence on screens and on social media, and the effect of lockdowns, so that we're as well prepared as we can be and as well informed by the leading and most recent research as we can be to help young people to be healthy and to lead flourishing lives as they leave our schools. It's going to be a real challenge, I think.
I'm absolutely certainly right. Do you think that, I mean, you mentioned there a moment ago just about different school structures and, for example, federated schools and so, do you think that that will help support young people by that sharing of expertise across, or is it purely that kind of structure? Is that purely a marriage of convenience in some ways? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
I don't think federated schools are generally marriages of convenience, or not, at least in my experience. But I do think that what they can provide, what I experience here at Berkhamsted, is a school with more than 2,000 pupils, with the resources that go with that number, but made up of a group of schools, therefore no school comprising more than 500 pupils. So that, or 510 pupils, so that the benefits of the large school can be one for pupils, but also the benefits of the small school, in which each person is known as an individual, can be one. And I do think there's something about knowing each child having a sense of an adult who is on their side. John Tomset uses an eye-catching phrase in one of his books. He says, "Who owns the child?" I don't particularly like that phrase, but I really understand what he means. Who is it who is most closely connected with the well-being of each child in the school, so that there isn't a possibility of the well-being of that child falling between the responsibilities of different staff? That we can be clear, wouldn't be good for young people.
And that's just made me think about something, because the question was going through my mind when you were saying, who owns the child? I was thinking, you're absolutely right. Who has that ownership? Is it the right person who has the ownership of that child? And I know we don't like that word ownership, but is it the right person? And if so, how do you ensure that's the case? And then my mind was just going ahead to, how do we recruit people into the profession who are those savvy people who are savvy about children, understand, really committed, have a vision, really able, great teachers, what are you seeing in terms of that whole recruitment piece?
During the pandemic, we saw, I think, nationally, a rise in people applying for teacher training. Our own experience has been see young people, as they leave university, applying for jobs in schools in large numbers, which I think is hugely encouraging. I think it's terrific that a reflection on priorities during the pandemic, I think, resulted in a greater social value being apparent for caring professions in medicine, in other forms of care, and in teaching and education. I think that's hugely to be welcomed. I think schools need to promote cultures which are attractive to young graduates to come and work in.
So what would that be then? I mean, what would that look like?
I think probably reflects listening to young people and not relying only on people in the advanced stages of life, which I now find myself. I think it's about making sure the school is an environment in which people of different ages and stages in their life, and people are inhabiting those slightly different cultures that come with different parts of the population pyramid, more diverse, more inclusive communities in which people find a really positive place to make a difference. And I think the fact that young people are so attracted to jobs that are going to make a difference is an enormously encouraging thing. I find spending time with our staff energizing and refreshing and encouraging, because they do want to make a difference and they see education as a place where they can. I think that culture of education as being transformative for young people is enormously important, and maybe something that we're in danger of losing for a while in terms of our national culture. But I think maybe we're finding again. I don't know, that may be unduly optimistic, but I do feel positive about the way in which education can contribute to the life of our country and the way that it is.
Yes, I mean, it's that issue, isn't it? People say, well, schools are a terrible drain on the economy, and I feel like saying, well, take away schools, see what happens to the economy then. It's just, yes. So I think optimism's a good thing. Optimism's like, well, if you're not optimistic, then who else is going to be in that school, no matter how devolved your leadership is, and equally across the whole profession, and across not just HMC, but all schools, across the country.
I think it's a precondition for teaching. If you're not optimistic about people, then I personally would be puzzled about why one would become a teacher.
That's very true.
Coming into a classroom, I always find the most exciting point of the year, that first week in September, when you find who your new classes are, find who your new groups that one's going to be responsible for in every area of school life, and the sense of possibility and potential. What could these people grow into individually, but also what can they grow into collectively to harness each other's abilities in this class or house or tutor group or team or cast or ensemble, whatever it is. I think that moment of possibility and potential as new pupils enter an environment is tremendously exciting, and that optimism I want to sustain for as much of the year as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what do you think are the major challenges then for schools in the UK and indeed beyond over the next few years?
I think there are a number. At a prosaic level, I think for independent schools, there's a challenge of affordability, making sure that school fees don't rise by more than earnings. I think that's been a challenge, will continue to be a challenge. I think being inclusive in a way which is not patronising. Yes. I sometimes think that we need to avoid the sort of Victorian colonial approach of going to places we don't understand and telling them how better to live. So I think there's a sense of inclusion being organic to an organisation. And I think lots of organisations, not just schools, are having to learn how to do that better quickly. And I think that's really important. It's a really important challenge. And I think we're asking more questions post-pandemic about the nature of our curriculum and of assessment and what it is that we're preparing people for. What kind of world are they going to live in and contribute to? I think those are all challenges that we need to face. And I think, to be candid, we live in a world which is less connected to each other. Globalization is in a bit of a crisis. And I think inclusivity also has something to speak into that, of not falling prey to a kind of nationalism or parochialism, which I think divides people. I would like to see people come out of school with an outlook of inclusivity, not just of the people they come across every day in school, but looking across the world. And empathy, I think, will be a really important skill for young people to use in the future. Many of them, of course, will be making working relationships only in the medium that we're using now in future, because they'll be working from home. And a new set of skills will be necessary to help them to do that. A workplace with no water cooler or photocopier moments is going to be a slightly different one that will require slightly different preparation.
You said something there a moment ago that just made me think about it when you were talking about the complexity of all of this. And you're talking about, complexity, the uncertainty of the future, globalization, pros and cons, all of those different elements. But there's that sense of we are part of schools are part of a really big system that helps take young people from childhood through to adulthood, but then delivers them into a wider world. But I'm just wondering, HMC has a powerful voice here in terms of how are you using that voice? How would you like to use that voice to make those wider shifts in society and not just support what's happening in school? I mean, we know that schools are real engines in their own way, and we know that beauty, that amazingness of the relationship between teacher and child and child, that fuels the growth there. But what can we do to capture that and actually make that something that turn it into something that makes a difference on a wider stage?
I think the HMC has made a contribution and continues to make a contribution. A few years ago, we're doing lots of work on making sure that public exams were as reliable as they could be, working with other sectors of schools, other groups of schools, to try to influence awarding bodies and regulators to improve the public exam space. I think there's been more work on that recently. Sarah Fletcher has chaired a report which sought information from people working in all kinds of schools and young people in all kinds of schools about the nature of assessment and curriculum for the future. A really interesting report which speaks not to the independent sector but to the British education system. And I think that we are working much more closely with the ASCL and with other bodies in education, with Ofqual and with JCQ, to try to use the collective wisdom and our ability to collaborate to improve outcomes for all people educationally by making the system better. And I think it's that collaboration that is key and will continue to be important. I think there's some really exciting work going on, and I think it's easy to forget the things that have come out of that kind of work, the EPQ being one example, and AS tracking, which I think 70,000 young people now use, started in independent schools. It was piloted in independent schools. So I think there are lots of things like that where we have the capacity to begin to collaborate or to engineer collaboration to find solutions to new problems, and to make sure that the experience of young people going forward is as good as we can make it in this country.
And you said there, you talked there about and then built on the British education system. And I know from working internationally now a lot that the British education system has got a really high reputation. And do you think that that's warranted, that reputation? Is it? What's your sense of that? When that's a really hard question to ask, isn't it?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not sure I'm an entirely independent witness in this debate. I'm definitely the witness for one side of it, and need to recognise that. And I think Lucy Crown's book, Cleverlands, is enormously helpful on this, and really interesting book.
Yeah.
I do think it is part of our British psyche that we undervalue many of the things about our country and our institutions. It's that self-deprecating sense of humour, which plays out sometimes in a more serious way, in an underestimation of the value of the things that we've got. I think education provides people with a number of things. One of them is a valuable and stable currency of qualification. And I think that has been the case. I think too frequent a set of changes can undermine that if we don't guard that deposit wisely. But I think the other thing is that British education stands for a more holistic approach to education. I'm really interested by the work of James Heckman, who's at the University of Chicago, on the impact on later life of what he calls cognitive education, things we might see tested in exams, and non-cognitive education, as he calls it, the softer skills, the personal management leadership skills, the team working, the skills. We talk a lot about independent education, independent learning. Actually, interdependent education, interdependent learning, I think is going to be more and more important in the future. And I think that's often the neglected bit of, if I can call it this, academic education structures. And I think British education stands for a more balanced juxtaposition of dependent, independent, and interdependent learning and skills. And I think good living, flourishing, requires self-knowledge and wise application of dependence, independence, and interdependence at the right time. So I think that's where some of the strength comes from, the breadth, a degree of stability. But it's a deposit that will need careful stewardship in future by politicians and by schools and those in between.
Yes, and underpinned by rigour as well, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of this stable and reliable currency. And currency, you can tell my degrees in economics, but a currency ceases to be as valuable if it's just minted to excess, if it loses its essential rigour. And I think education is not unlike that.
So, final question for you today. If you had a crystal ball and you could look into the future, and economists are supposed to have crystal balls, aren't they?
Economists are famous for making terrible forecasts. And
Well,
there's one economist I love who's said to have predicted 7 of the last 2 recessions, which I think is a beautiful form of words.
Yes, that's right. Well, imagine you've got an education crystal ball, speaking as an educator, and you're looking, say, 5 years into the future. So before the end of the decade, 5 years into the future, what do you think education in the UK will look like then? Now, you don't have to go down to the micro detail in this, but just kind of a sense of where do you think it's going to be in 5 years' time?
The optimist in me says we will have brought out and we will have resolved many of the psychological consequences of the pandemic and the lockdowns and the disrupted education, and of course all the other things which schools provide for young people, particularly those from the most chaotic backgrounds. So I hope we will have fully opened, cleaned, healed that wound in our young people's development. I think recognizing it is as far as I think we've really got at this stage, and I think making sure that there are no long-term consequences for well-being and mental health from those things, I think will be critical. I am optimistic about that because I'm optimistic about the resilience of young people. I think we will still be debating a lot of the same things because we have been for a long time.
Yes.
And actually part of the strength of education is it's willing to be self-critical.
Yes.
I think the willingness to be self-critical about curriculum, assessment, skills, and the nature of the future is key, and avoiding us as self-referencing education only to prepare people to be good at education. And that's not to take a utilitarian position either, that education is only about making people in a more productive economic unit. I genuinely, I don't believe in that, and I don't think there is any traction for that in this country, at least I hope not. But I do think there will be a continued debate. One of the questions I think it's helpful to ask is, if someone is going to become a surgeon, in what year will a current, let's say a child starting year 7 in September 22, what year will they become a consultant? And I think the answer to that for 2022 year 7 pupils is 2043.
Gosh.
And I think it's a wise, I think a wise person would avoid making too precise a prediction of what consultant surgeons will be doing in 2043. Or certainly I wouldn't want to. There may be others with more insight into that who feel more confident about it. So I think we're moving through, you mentioned complexity earlier, and the speed of change is another factor. I think we're moving through a period of preparing people with the agility and resilience to contend with the complexity and the rapidity of change that they will face in the future, whilst retaining or improving our humanity. And the Black Lives Matter movement, the Everyone's Invited movement, called us to a better version of our own humanity, I think. And I think combining that focus on skills and qualities development needs to be a socio-emotional focus on the quality of our humanity. And I think that is another area where we will be, the work that is being done at the moment will have borne real fruit in 5 years' time. What the new problems will be that schools will be contending with, I couldn't say at this stage. If I could, I would be making my fortune writing columns of newspapers. But there will be new problems, and there will be leaders with the insight to solve them as well, I'm sure.
Let's leave it there on those thoughts about the future. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you. Really enjoyed this. It was nice catching up again. So thank you.
Very nice to see you again, Helen.